Hey guys, I'm Tyler Mahoney.
And I'm Jeff Falkenberry. We're back
for another edition of the Endless Season Outdoors podcast. It is right at the very beginning of June, and we've got a special guest with us here today, our good buddy Chris Brooke, who is the Truman Lake Fisheries Management Biologist, and we are super excited to be talking to him. We're actually going to have him on a couple of times. Today we're going to be talking about the species that are native to the lake, the crappie, the bass, the catfish. The next time we have him on, we're going to be talking about the walleye, the hybrids, get into the spoonbill a little bit as well. But we wanted to introduce Chris to you. Chris, how's it going, man?
Good, I'm doing well.
Yeah, well, we're really glad to have you here.
I'm glad to be here. Excited, it's the summer. Everything's starting to roll. Get out on the lake more. I mean, not that we don't spend enough time on the lake in the winter, but things are changing fast. And it's an exciting time of the year, and happy to be on here to talk about fishing.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, Chris, tell us a little bit about kind of your career trajectory, how you came to be with the MDC and doing the Truman Lake Fisheries Management.
I started working a little bit in fisheries as an hourly in the summer on a catfish project back in 2005. I worked out of Chillicothe, and as an 18-year-old, I went on a boat and tagged big flatheads to catfish all summer. So that was pretty awesome.
That had to be awesome.
And went to school at MU, and did that while I was working in the summer for MDC for 4 years, and then a couple years in Tennessee getting my master's degree, and then jumped up to Alaska for about 4 years, and then a couple years with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and then I've been here in Clinton as the Truman Lake Fisheries Management Biologist for about 3.5 years.
Gotcha. Now, where are you from originally?
I'm from Norburn, Missouri.
Okay.
So
okay,
if you go straight north and cross the Missouri River, you'll be pretty close.
Okay. All right. Well, fantastic. So, actually, I'm very curious. So, Alaska, just real quick, what was that like? That had to be pretty cool.
It was pretty cool.
Yeah.
I was a fishing guide when I first went up there for silver salmon. It was just a 9-week deal, but it was an amazing salmon run in Alaska on an amazing river, just a great time. And then
was that on a Kenai or what?
No,
river?
I was on the Sayou River, which is a little bitty river, kind of between Cordova and Yakutat.
Okay.
Sort of in southeast Alaska, but people that are from the peninsula, the islands down there will say that that's not really southeast. If you look at the big block, it's the southeast corner.
Yeah.
And then after that, I worked on fishing boats, mostly out of Dutch Harbor, Kodiak Island.
Yeah.
Jumped around a little bit.
You have any run-ins with bears while you're up there?
Yes. Never got closer than about 20 or 25 yards, but
that's close enough.
I was gonna say that's close enough for my book. Goodness gracious.
Yeah. So you've come back down to Clinton, Missouri, and found old Truman Lake, and 3.5 years now you've been able to get on this little doozy.
Yeah.
So tell us about your 3.5 years up to this point. What's it been like? What are some of the projects you've been working on? What's kind of like your daily routine like?
Well, to almost skip back a second here, when I came to the lake, when I was a kid, I'd come to Truman Lake. I think.
Sure.
I was born in February, and my parents said my first trip to the lake was when I was 2 weeks old. So that means we were coming to the lake a lot.
Yeah.
And I spent a lot of time over the years fishing Truman, but you can spend some time on it and still not really know a lot about it, especially from a biological standpoint.
Sure.
So for me, the first 3.5 years have been, getting to know more about the lake, but more about the fisheries, get to know the people that are out there, you and other guides, and what they're saying and what they're seeing, what people want, understanding, what's important to everyone.
And still good for the resource.
And what's good for the resource. And then at the same time trying to understand the resource and kind of settle into some, long-term protocols. And for me, just part of my personality and how I look at things, I want to set everything up that so in 10, 15, 20 years from now, I'm where I want to be.
Yeah.
And I mean that from a, the job's going where I want it to be. I've
Yep.
set everything up. I've got the samples I want, and there's a lot of perspective that is nice to have when you start looking at data and how a fishery is. And when I first got here, people talked about at the Crappie that they used to always win the tournaments on the Osage, and now they're winning them on the Grand. And what's changed, and I don't have the data. We didn't trap net on the Grand. Most when everything, the original biologist that had the lake just kind of started going on the Osage, I think there were some issues with trap netting on the Grand because of all the timber, and I'm not sure exactly why we settled in the way we did, but 35, 40 years later, we don't have that much data on the Grand. And I'm trying to set everything up so that, not just understand what's going on now, but hopefully prepare, if something changes, that I'll have the data to understand it.
Sure.
Down the road.
Well, my thinking, I know exactly what you're talking about there with people saying, well, yeah, the tournaments were all won on the Osage, and then it's flipped back over to the Grand or whatever. I think, number one, you have way more people fishing the Grand. Typically the tournaments are, the weigh-in is somewhere over on the Grand Arm. Rarely do you ever have a weigh-in unless it's like a fish by the hour deal where they'll have a weigh-in site at Tally Bend or somewhere like that. So typically most of your weigh-ins are always on the Grand, so people are going to fish closer to the weigh-in, even in a tournament where you can trailer, because believe it or not, fishing a live well going down the highway around like coming from Tally Bend, there's a lot of curves, and you can beat some fish up in a live well. So you take that risk of losing a fish coming from the Osage to a weigh-in at the Grand. But when you talk about the Osage and the Grand, to me, you're talking about two different animals. You're talking about a Great Dane and a Labrador, because the Osage is so much bigger. I mean, when people say, well, the guy's fishing on the upper Osage, well, the upper Osage is everything pretty much. If somebody says the upper Osage, from Berry Bend all the way up to the Sac River, And when you talk
farther than that, if you want to keep going.
If you want to keep going, yeah. And you talk about the upper Grand, and you're talking about Sparrowfoot to Bucksaw. That's the upper Grand. And so, you've got an animal this big and you've got an animal this big. So, I know in biologically speaking, I mean, you have to compare apples to apples, and that's really not.
But, kind of what you're getting into, it gets complicated a little more if you start getting into regulations. And what would be a good regulation? Well, we've got, I can tell you we have 3 different systems, 4 different systems, 5 different systems. Now, see, the more I think about it, the more I want to tack one on it. It's like we have 5 different systems that could almost, have separate regulations or be managed differently. And I say, and that's counting the upper Osage, and the upper Grand is one. I'm not even dividing them up, but both tributaries, Tebow and Palmy, are a lot different than the Grand and the Osage.
100%.
The lower lake, I don't necessarily see a lot of difference between the lower Osage and the lower Grand. Maybe it's there. I'm not saying it's not.
Right.
The lower lake's different than the middle lake if you get around Bucksaw or Berry Bend, and then if you go a little bit farther up, the upper part of the lakes are different too. And in some ways, I think the upper Osage is more similar to the upper Grand.
Yes.
Than the middle Osage or the middle
Sure.
Grand.
And a question we get a lot is, well, why are the bigger fish up there? Well, me traveling the country, doing seminars all over the place, the first thing I think of is the dirtier water, they have a longer growing season. So the water stays warmer longer. So people say, well, Grenada, Mississippi grows giant crappie. Well, they have a long growing season. I mean, that's just how it is. Yeah, they have a 12-inch length limit, but that's just a small piece of the puzzle, right? I mean, it's that longer growing season. So those fish up closer to the river, dirtier water, and probably more nutrient, soil, and stuff that I don't even know.
Yeah.
But that longer growing season is...
You get a few more nutrients when you go upstream.
Sure.
Tebow struggles and some of the nutrient data that the Corps has that they take. Tebow is kind of on the lower end when it comes to nutrients in the system. There's so much, and why does a certain area of the lake have bigger fish? And there's 2 possible answers. Either they live longer or they grow faster.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And what's interesting, I guess you can ask that question, and I've kind of looked around in the data I've seen and the fish I've aged. I think there's a little bit of both. I think they're growing faster and they're living longer, and then to try to answer why that is that's what I love about my job.
Right.
I look at it as a 30-year project, and I think there's plenty of things to work on. And I've aged fish that were close to 15 inches. I aged one just recently that was 5 years old, and I aged two of them actually a few years ago that were 15 inches, and they were 11 years old. So one of them grew fast, and the other two just lived a long time.
And there's genetics that play a part in that too, right? I mean, a fish that lives 11 and a fish that lives to 5 or 6. You know what I mean?
Well, now you're just trying to complicate it.
I mean, it's true though, right?
Well, yeah, it's going to be true, but at the same time, at a lake level, I don't know that there's anything, from my standpoint, I don't know that there's anything I can do to affect the genetics realistically. We could now.
Yeah, I mean, you can't. It's not like growing big deer. But I'm just saying, genetically, fish are just like people. I mean, you can have a young big fish, you can have an old big fish, just like what you're saying. I mean, I'm taller than you, or I'm taller than Tyler's dad, but he's older than me. You know what I mean? I mean, fish have got to be the same way.
Well, they are, and I know, and then you have your difference between your black crappie and your white crappie, and that is a genetic difference, obviously. And then the hybrid crappies, anytime I see a picture on Facebook and it's a monster crappie, it's a hybrid.
All the time.
They're crossed, with the whites and the blacks, and
there
aren't very many of them out there. I don't know that I actually know the answer to that question, but I don't think they do.
I
don't think so. I haven't looked at it too hard in the literature.
I've always heard they don't.
I don't think they do. I know when you get into hybrids, I've aged a bunch of hybrid striped bass,
right?
And there's none of them in the year classes that we don't stock, which tells me they're
not reproducing themselves.
But then I know something like a hybrid bluegill will reproduce a little bit, and then there's a lot of fish species they'll have intragrades is what they'll call them, where they kind of back cross, and then you get these kind of in between
weird
areas. Yeah, and I think largemouths and spotted bass will do that.
Yeah.
I don't think black and white crappie will, but I haven't dug into the literature and looked at that.
Yeah.
So overall, if you were just kind of give the state of the crappie lake wide or per arm, I mean, Truman Lake's sitting pretty good if you look at on Facebook what the guides are doing, but can you fill us in a little bit on overall population, just general statistics you've seen on some of the different arms?
I think most everything looks pretty good right now.
Yeah.
A lot of times I see questions, where's the best place to fish Truman Lake for crappie? And I say, well, it's all good. It's all good, but it's not all the same.
Mm-hmm. And not all at the same time.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Well, you're the fisherman that knows that.
Well, that's the beauty of it. If the water's too dirty one place, you go find some cleaner water another. If the water's too cool, or I've been chasing 70-degree water. I should have had it a month ago. But, we're running a little late this spring, and now we're starting to get those 70-degree temperatures. But I've spent some miles running that down, trying to get that 70-degree water. But I don't think it's just the guides, though. The general public, Truman Lake is known for one of the top 10 lakes in the United States for crappie fishing. A person can come down about any given weekend for the most part and be pretty successful. And I don't know what to attribute that to. Do you think that Truman is a young lake?
I don't know how to answer that question.
I look at some different ones and I still think it's mature, and I don't think it's hit its potential. You was talking like a 30-year plan. I think it's got some really good things that are going to happen.
I think, there's a lot of good stuff ahead of you. A lot of reservoirs, almost all the reservoirs go through a boom period, and that lasts 10 or 15 years. So, I don't think we're in that boom.
Okay.
I think that initial boom ended 1990, 1995, and that's not a surprise. That's just what you expect.
Sure.
So from that standpoint, we're kind of through that, especially for largemouth bass, that period where everything just goes amazing.
Oh yeah.
And I think everybody knows that. We've seen that over the years, and that's just that's just how it works out biologically. But I don't like to make a lot of predictions about where the lake's going to go in the future.
No, you can't.
'Cause you don't know. But you know, and I think we've seen it fill in a little bit over time. You get around deep water and things like that, and I think the Corps has some data on that. If it's something you were interested in, we could look into later and dig into. As far as, you know, from a sedimentation standpoint, you know, how are we looking? How long is it going to be between? How long is it going to be before, you know, Truman Lake is a mud puddle like Montrose?
Right.
This just filled in, which I don't think it's any time close.
No.
Because it's a big lake and there's a lot of water out there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another variable you get dealt, because you're also trying to biologically maintain a flood control impoundment. So not only do you have, you know, the water temperature, the water clarity, but then you got water levels to deal with all the time, and what fish you lose. You know,
Well, I lose fish.
yeah,
I'm sure I lose fish. I don't know that we probably don't lose a lot of crappie. We might lose a few, but you start getting into your hybrids and your blue cats and your paddlefish. Those especially are the fish that are moving a little more. I think we lose a lot of them,
I agree.
which isn't always a bad thing.
Yeah, no,
Now it's a bad thing for there's not a lot to be gained from losing paddlefish, but for blue cats especially, you know, we've got enough blue cats.
Yeah.
We can give a few to Lake of the Ozarks and it's not going to hurt us.
No. So you mentioned you do trap netting for crappie. What's that process like? What time of the year are you doing it? Where? What kind of areas are you doing it?
We typically trap net in October.
Okay. And why is that?
Well, to some extent because that's when it's always been done.
Okay.
Wait, I've looked in. I've thought about trying to do some in the spring. More than anything, kind of compare that to the October data. And I say because it's always been done that way. But once you get a data set that you have 30 years, 40 years worth of data in it,
change that.
it's nice to be consistent.
Right.
So there's not a lot of reasons to change off of what we've been doing.
So there's not a biological reason to do it in the fall. You could do it all year long, and that would be okay, and then keep it consistent.
No.
Oh, okay.
So if you do it when the water's too warm, you just kill fish.
Okay.
Yeah,
I've had some times we get out there, you jump the gun a little bit, and you go the first week of October, and then you have a trail of fish behind you, which I try not to do.
Yeah.
I'm not going to lie to you either. That's,
Yeah.
you know, but that's part of the reason. You know, you got to watch the water temperatures, and we want to drop down into the 60s for sure before we start doing it.
I figured fish safety had something
And
to do
then,
with it.
so that's why you can't go in the summer. You can't go in the spring. I've thought about, and I was going to try to see if I could get some in this spring, and then it started raining, and the lake jumped up.
Yeah.
And the other thing in the spring, you got so much going on,
Yeah.
and you just kind of got to time it out when you can do it, and you don't want to do it in the winter because it's really really cold out there.
Yeah.
If you can do it in October, there's no reason for us to do it in January.
Right.
And you could have a year like this and the lake freezes up in January.
Mm-hmm.
But it's kind of that's just when it works out to do it.
Yeah.
April starts getting there's plenty of things for me to do in April.
Yeah.
And by the time I don't want to trap net when there's a boat in every cove crappie fishing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that kind of plays into it a little bit.
So that brings up a good question. How easily can you see these trap nets if you are a boater and you're going along and fishing? Do you have buoys everywhere that you can?
There's some buoys, so there'll be a line coming down from the bank, and there's basically a lead net. So it's a single net that herds the fish into basically a box on the back end.
Gotcha.
And you should be able to see the buoys floating there. We do catch a few crappie jigs every year.
Yeah, that's what I was curious about. Now, do these nets, so you get a lot of crappie, but are they designed specifically for crappie, or do you end up with all kinds of fish?
They work really well for crappie.
Okay.
They also use them for muskies and some of the muskies
Okay.
although they'll use a slightly different design, a bigger net.
Mm-hmm.
But for the most part, we catch a little bit of everything, but we catch a lot more crappie
Yeah.
than we do of everything else.
Yeah.
So as it stands right now, from a marine biology standpoint, you feel pretty good about where we're at with the crappie situation.
I feel pretty good about most of it. The black crappie in Big Tebow up around the Windsor Crossing area, there's a lot of little fish. They might, I don't want to use the word stun out,
Yeah.
but they're a little bit slower growing over there, specifically just the black crappie.
Yeah.
The white crappie do okay on the Tebow arm. And I don't know, we may see a few more fish stacking up that don't want to get to 9 inches, or, you'd like to see them bigger than 9 inches. You'd like to see them get 9.5, 10 inches. And,
Sure.
And when I did a bunch of age data, I've been doing a lot of age data every year, but 2019 kind of changed things.
Yeah. The flood. Yeah.
So in 2018, I was seeing quite a few black crappie that were 8, 9 inches long, and they may be 3, 4, 5 years old.
Oh wow.
And that starts to get into a problem area.
Right.
If you have very many of those. But 2019 kind of reset everything,
Sure.
and everything was bigger. Everything grew well.
I think Smithville Lake run into that, and they
Yeah.
lowered the length limit on.
Yeah, you
black
can
crappie.
keep 15 above 9 inches and 15, I swear it's below.
You can keep 30 total.
Yes.
And no more than 15 over 9 inches.
Gotcha. Yep. Yep.
And the hope with that is to push anglers towards keeping a few more of those 8-inch black crappie, or even 6, 7-inch black crappie.
Yeah.
And so far things have worked out really well at Smithville since they put that on, but they put it on in 2019.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you were going to pick a year to do it, they picked a
Perfect.
good year for it to turn around and be great
Yeah.
at the end of the year.
Yeah.
I don't know how. That's not to say the regulation didn't help, but I'm sure the high water helped at least a little bit.
Yeah.
When you're aging these fish, what exactly are you looking at on the fish to age them?
So they have what we call an otolith, which is basically an ear bone
Okay.
that's in their head, and that's typically what I use to age them. So I'll take that out, and then I soak them in a little solution, ethanol, glycerin, for a week, 2 weeks. It's really not important how long.
Yeah.
It clears them up. I don't know how it does it. I just know that if you look at them when you pull them and you stick them in the solution and look at them again in a week, you can see the rings better. And they have rings on them like a tree.
Really?
And
Okay.
I guess I would say you just count them up, but sometimes there's a little more involved with it than that.
Yeah.
You get them under the microscope and you look at them. Most of the crappie I can age whole, but sometimes I'll have to, if they're not real clear, you can break them in half and sand them in section and get a little thin sliver on them, put them on a microscope slide and look at them under the microscope, and they'll show up a little better.
Yeah.
So do you anticipate, I mean, it sounds like things are looking pretty good on Truman for crappie. Is there any regulation changes at all that have been looked at, considered? I mean, even on the table, is there data even show that anything is even necessary to change or whatever?
Right now, nothing's going to change anytime very soon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And and any time we start to change regulation, you're looking at, it doesn't happen fast unless there's a reason for it to happen fast. So even if I started working on it, trying to push something today, it would probably be realistically 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
And that's not to say we couldn't beat that timeline, but there's a process that goes into play. And if there's not a reason to just rush out there and do it, then we're
Right.
going to take the data we need.
Right.
And I think when we put the slot in place, we were working on that close to 5 years.
That was a long time. Yeah.
Because when I worked for Zach Ford in 2009, and he was just starting to kind of get into that. We were starting to look at some stuff.
Yeah.
And then it was 2014 when we put that into place. So, that was a little more complicated than some.
Right.
We did change the spotted bass regulations a couple years ago. I'm
Yeah.
not sure how long that took, but it went through pretty smoothly.
Yes.
That was just before I got here. It went through smoothly, but
And that
It
was
was-
lowering the length limit on the
12
spotted
inches,
bass to
Right,
12.
from 15 to 12. So it separated the largemouth and the spotted bass.
Yeah.
But in something like that, that's biologically, it's pretty easy, and there wasn't a lot of people against it. That was a pretty easy change, and it didn't have,
Yeah, I think most tournaments
Really
just
hard.
left it at 15 inches.
Yeah.
You can't even bring a 12-inch spotted bass
Yeah.
in.
It depends on the tournament, because there are one or two here or there that'll
Yeah.
let you bring it. But yeah, I'm pretty sure you are correct. Overall, it's the 15-inch mark.
Let's talk about the catfish.
Yeah, you mentioned the slot, so great time to chat a little bit about that. Jeff, you fish for catfish all the time, so I'm
I
sure,
do.
sure you've got several questions and thoughts on this topic.
I know you've been doing some studies and some agent studies and stuff, and I know that the slot was a 7-year study or 8.
So we said that we'd come back and look at it no sooner than 8 years.
Okay.
And we're starting to talk about that.
We're rounding that corner now, right?
Yeah, what is it, 2021 now? So
Yeah.
we've had it
When
in
did it-
place for
In 14.
14. So
Okay.
we've had it in place for 7 years, and there's a little talk about what are we going to do, but we did all that work in the fall. So the soonest we would start anything would be the fall of 2022. So it's on our minds. We're thinking about it, but then, we still got to start looking at budget and
Yep.
everything else going on in the world and what's going to work out.
So have you seen that with your data from 14 or whenever it was, which we've had, I don't know how many floods since then. And so, and my biggest thing when that was all going on was the consistency of data on a situation like that. Because we had some pretty good raises in, I want to say, maybe 12. I'm trying to think back and I can't remember breakfast, but I'm just saying, you can't, it's hard to say, well, here's what's in the lake when we lose what's through the dam, or we gain what comes from Kansas, what comes from Duck Lakes, or wherever it comes from. You know what I mean? Have you seen like any kind of impact, negative or positive?
So I'll start by saying I think blue catfish are the most complicated fish for me to manage because, I tell people all the time, with crappie, if I give people a 10-inch limit of crappie every time they go out on the lake, most people are going to be happy.
Sure.
For catfish, the trophy anglers want everything turned loose.
Oh, yeah.
The jug liners want to keep everything, and it's hard. It's harder to find, just from the anglers. It's harder to find that happy medium.
Yeah.
And then you throw in a species that the growth has seemed to have slowed down over the history of the lake. We stocked blue cats, I think, in 1991 or 92.
And they went crazy.
Which, they were in the lake before that. They've always been in the lake.
Yeah, absolutely. Like come out
But
of the
it's
river.
but that tells you the numbers weren't where they are today
Oh.
in the early 90s. I don't know that it was necessary. I don't know if it had anything to do with those stockings or whether we just had some good years that kind of went through a phase where they took off. But it's definitely, it changes over time, and they live for so long. So I aged a fish a couple years ago. I think it actually came out of Lake the Ozarks, but it was 29 years old.
Wow.
How big was it?
68 pounds, I think is
Wow.
what it was.
Wow.
29 years old.
That's got to be on the tail end of the lifespan. Or can they live for 40, 50 years?
I've seen a study they did out in Tennessee. I think it was on Fort Loudon, where they'd aged a few fish that were 34 years old. I think they have some contamination issues out there, so they don't let people keep fish. So they
Yeah.
just have this fishery
Yeah,
where
just growing like weeds.
they get stunted out a little bit, but they grow for a long time. They can be there for a long time. We see a lot of fish. Well, it's kind of a relative statement, but we see quite a few fish. I've aged quite a few that were 20 years older or older.
And they weren't big giants.
Well,
What's the smallest 20-year-old fish you ever weighed? Roughly. You don't have to be dead on.
So some of them are taking 20 years to get 35 inches, I think, close to it. I'd have to go look at the numbers a little closer. A lot of those fish 38, 40 inches are 20 years old. A
Wow.
lot of fish coming out of the slot are 15 years old,
Good
or maybe more
Lord.
than that.
That's wild.
And so, and yeah, not to, get into the overly complicated stuff that goes on, but, when I look at the blue catfish age and growth, most species, they grow real fast, and then if you look at it on a chart, they tail off and they kind of plateau. And I don't see that with the blue catfish in Truman. It's just a straight line.
Yeah, they just keep growing.
And maybe.
Or they stop growing.
Well, they keep growing, which, and this is one of I don't really know the answer to that question.
Yeah.
But I have two main theories. Either they keep growing, which would be to say there's a whole bunch of little fish, and they're kind of stunted out, they're growing slow, and then once they start to get out of that glut of fish, when they're 15, 20 inches long, they start growing faster. And, I hear a lot of people say, well, they can eat those shad or the bigger fish. Well, the bigger a blue catfish you are, the more you can eat.
Sure.
Mhm.
The more opportunity there is out there. And then all of a sudden, you have anglers catching all those 20-inch fish. And you went from, you take a fish that went from being 15 inches and had a whole bunch of friends he was competing against to 25 inches, or let's put him in the slot at 26 inches. And all of a sudden, he doesn't have near as many friends. There's not near as many other catfish at the table. And they start, I think there's a possibility they start growing a little bit faster, or at least maintain the growth that they don't necessarily do in a lot of species. The other possibility, which is biologically and as an angler, it's not near as easy to hear. The other possibility is they're just not growing as fast as they used to. And when you age fish, you're not looking at a current growth, you're looking at a history of growth. So a 20-year-old fish was subject to, if they were growing faster 15 to 20 years ago, then he got to experience that 5-year period 15 to 20 years ago where they grew faster. So if they're slowly kind of slowing down over time, how fast they grow, then that can kind of, when you plot all those ages and lengths on a chart, make it look like they're not slowing down in their growth over time, that they're just continuing to grow and grow and grow, when really those older fish got to grow a little faster when they were younger.
Okay.
Which is part of why catfish are complicated, because they can grow for 25 or 30 years, whereas our crappie,
Right.
we turn over that. Most of our crappie we don't have any fish over 4 or 5 years old. And I say I see plenty of 7-year-old fish.
Yeah.
I see quite a few up to 7, but the majority of the crappie
4 or
are the fish you're keeping are 2, 3, 4-year-old fish.
Yeah.
Most of them,
Yeah.
a few 5s. If you're catching the 13 and 14 inchers you're catching are 5, 6, 7 years old.
Mm-hmm.
But I can study the crappie for 10 years and see different life cycles go through. You can't do that with catfish.
Right.
You study them for 30 years and see one life cycle go through.
Well, I'm seeing more. I mean, the sport of catfishing has gotten much bigger than it ever was, and that was before they stocked Truman Lake with blue cats in the '90s. So the sport has gotten huge, but we're seeing more fish. I mean, than ever. But I think that's because the limit's bigger, right? I mean, you keep twice as many fish, so now you see twice as many as you did back then. But and I think I remember that stocking in the late '90s. I think that was Kevin Sullivan, I think, who did a lot of that, or some of the tagging studies.
So
and
Kevin did he did the Catfish Diaries, and then he did the tagging study.
Yeah.
And that was early 2000s.
Maybe like 03, 02, 03.
03 is
like
the
that.
year I'm thinking, but I'm not sure whether that was the beginning or the end.
Yeah.
I think that may have been the end. So he may have did like 01 to 03 on his tagging.
But I can remember, and I can go through pictures and books, and I know where there's photo albums from years and years and years of regular. But before that late 90s, it was all big flatheads. And rarely you might catch a blue, And then after that, then you had all blues and rarely a flathead. And I think we're really there now. What do you think?
I don't remember the late 90s. That's what I think. I remember being on the lake in the late 90s, but I don't,
We
I
do
don't
not
know enough about
have
the flatheads.
a third of the flathead population we had. I will 100% guarantee that. And I attribute it to nothing more than blue cats. Because we didn't have those then, And now that they've blown up like they are, which is good. I mean, I love obviously, I mean, I'm a living doing it. But I really think that was the demise of the flathead.
I don't know that that's a question I have an answer for.
I
can speculate, but I don't know. I don't know whether the habitat changes. Your flatheads like your big trees and stuff like that. I don't know if the habitat has changed, or maybe not to question your memory, but maybe you hit the flathead harder when you didn't have blue cats to chase after.
Yeah, but I'm talking. It wasn't me. I mean, it wasn't just me. But.
Right.
Do flatheads and blues spawn around the same time?
I think so.
Blue flatheads will come in usually around the end of May, 1st of June. And blues will be shortly after.
Gotcha. But the flatheads, they're spawning in like up underneath freaking rocks and logs. Are blues in that same type of structure for when they spawn?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think they just got outnumbered.
Yeah.
100%. And deep down in my heart. I mean, I can remember growing up here. I've been on this thing since. Well, I was born in '80. And I've been on it all my life. And my grandfather and father were some of the best trot liners that run through there. And I mean, we used to catch flatheads and flatheads and flatheads. And now you can run for weeks to catch a few. I mean, it's just not like it was.
Yeah.
But we didn't have the blue cats then.
I know there's still some big flatheads out there.
Oh, I do too. We catch them. I mean,
but as far as what the numbers are, I don't know that I'd have a way to compare the numbers now to the 90s. I don't know that there's not. Flatheads catfish in general are among the toughest species to sample. You can electrofish them, but then you start getting into biases because it's like you can electrofish them, but then there's a lot of questions of how well does it work, when does it work, which fish are you getting all the fish of all the sizes. And we just, I don't have any historical data on flatheads for the most part. It's not entirely true. So then it makes me, I can't make a lot of statements about how it was in the 90s because I don't have data about it.
Jake Allman had told me, I swear it was about the flatheads, because I've been with them where we were sampling walleyes up in the Lee Summit area, and he's just telling me stories about doing it for different kinds of fish, and he acted like the flatheads, there's a lead boat, but that the flatheads just don't always pop up right there, that they have another boat doing like a snake behind them because they might pop up way off to the right or left, and it could be kind of hard to even get a hold of a fish that got temporarily stunned. Is that
right? And that's you're chasing rabbits now. But yes, flatheads, if you go out, we'll use two boats. And we got a project we're just starting right now on Truman with flatheads that I'm a little bit involved with. I need to get out more. It's an excuse for me to go chase flatheads. And I haven't got out and done it, which is not been good because, that's what I love my job for. But they have two boats, so you have one that'll sit there and shock. And they have talked about the importance of, sitting in that one place and waiting and letting the other boat chase. And fish will come out, they actually, is part of a different study, they were shocking in some hatchery ponds. And they shocked in one pond and they had flatheads, and the next pond start coming up and surfacing.
Really?
Wow.
So it shocked them through the levee between the ponds.
Interesting.
And when you talk to biologists, and it's not just in Missouri, but they got a big study going on. I think it's in Oklahoma now about electrofishing flatheads. You get into electrofishing catfish, and you heard some information from Jake, and it's like everybody kind of has what they think works, but there's a struggle to really key in on the details and the exact settings, and you hear about the crank telephone, but we have some pretty complicated boxes that we take out there, and there's different options of what you put in the water.
Yeah.
I'll just put it that
Yeah.
way. And trying to figure out what works best and
For the fish and being safe for the fish. And I've seen some shock fishing, and I mean, you get one chance, you know, if you in creeks and streams, and you know, if a flathead rolls up, you get one chance to get him. Because if you touch him, he's gone.
They can do, they can do that.
Jake, it might be interesting to talk to him about the flatheads because I'm pretty sure he comes down to Truman every year, and he just did it. I believe it's Truman, where it's an annual flathead catfish.
I think that
trip.
was Smithville.
Okay.
He makes some trips to.
Yeah.
He makes some Truman trips, but I think they
does.
do their annual
Gotcha.
trips. I think on
Yeah.
their big one is on Smithville.
Yeah.
So back to the slot. What are you evaluating? So we're coming up to when you're gonna start it. What are the things you're gonna be looking at to determine if it made a positive impact? And I mean, what is a positive impact per what the goals were? What are you gonna be looking at to determine if it continues or changes might need to happen?
So the method, we'll go back and use the same methods we used and I can't even remember the years. Before we put the slot on, we sampled for 3 years. I think maybe it was, 10, 11, and 12, something like that. I don't remember exactly what years it was, but we sampled for 3 years with jug lines, and we use jug lines because there's a lot of people that use jug lines on the lake, and it's rather than, we could go out and electrofish, but there's some biases with electrofishing. Most people in the biological world and in the science realm have concerns about whether or not you can effectively catch the big fish.
Yeah.
And that's not to say you don't catch them. You do catch big fish, but not necessarily at the same rate as they're in the population. So we looked at using jug lines because that just seemed to be the most realistic method.
Yeah.
Pole and line might be a good way too, but
Rather than guides fishing every day.
some of my
That would have been my idea.
some of my supervisors may think, "Are you sure that's the best way to do it?" And even if we said yes, they may be like, "Are you sure?"
Yeah.
I don't know that we need. People frown upon MDC boats out fishing.
Yeah,
for
oh, yeah.
reels, I'm sure. I'm sure they would. That's so that's part of the reason we end up jug lining. Is it's a method that's relatively easy, and it mimics what a lot of people are doing and a lot of people are going to see. And basically, you just sink a ton of effort into it and try to catch a ton of fish, and go back and look at is the size structure bigger? So we'll look at the size structure. We'll plot everything up and see, are there more big fish or are there not more big fish? What are we looking at? And then we'll look at age and growth stuff. We're going to age a bunch of fish. I talked about the otoliths, but for catfish, you can take the otoliths or you can take their pectoral spine, and you can do that without killing the fish.
Okay.
So we'll do some of that and look at a bunch of those fish and see how fast they're growing and just kind of reevaluate what it looks like. Which, you ask for, what are your objectives or goals? I don't want to dodge objectives, but at the same time, you just kind of have to, there's a lot of times, well, let me see what we find, and then we'll figure out where we need to go.
Yeah.
From there.
100%.
So, I guess, kind of get back to a question you asked earlier, I think in what little, I haven't done a lot of stuff, I haven't done a lot of sampling for catfish because we're kind of in this interim area where we're just waiting.
Yes.
But what I have been out, it seems to me like when we've set jug lines that we've caught more big fish. And I think there's a lot of people catching more fish in the slot. When I've done it out personally, it seems like we catch more slot fish or over the slot fish. I've talked to a few guides. I don't know if all the guides agree with that.
Yeah.
I don't know where you stand on that. I don't know whether you think you're seeing bigger fish. But it's a hard question to answer unless you get a bunch of fish.
I think for me, this is opinion. I think we're catching some bigger fish. We can say that we're catching more slot fish, but we never had slot fish before. So it's hard to say we're catching more than something we didn't have. Right. So,
But that's good.
I don't know.
From a size distribution, if you didn't have slot fish before, and you're catching.
No, I mean we didn't.
Well,
nobody measured.
you're
Nobody
not
paying
measured
attention.
catfish.
Yeah.
You're not talking. You didn't measure.
Yeah.
I thought you meant you didn't have that size.
No, no.
You
I
had
mean,
that
you just weren't
size
paying
range.
attention.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
you just catch fish. You got
Right.
5 of them, and
Right.
you were good to go.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, you wanted to go get you 5 somewhere around that 8-10 pound range. Call it a day and
Mm-hmm.
you go with it. But for me, it has the reverse effect, right? Because I mean, we don't keep a lot of big fish, but also I'm not going to tell somebody that they can't keep one because that's what they're paying me to do, is take fishing.
Right.
But we, you know, you educate people, and we release a ton of big fish.
Yeah.
But we've kept more big fish now, and we're throwing back 10 pounders. Right. If I have a person on the boat and we throw back 6, 7, 8, 10 pounders, and they catch a 28 pounder, they're eating it. And I think the jug liners for sure, and the trout liners are that way 100%. You know, because they're baiting bigger. There's a little. No, I'm not going to say less work, because if you trout line hard, it's work. You know that. And I mean, jug lining's the same way. If you're catching fresh bait and you're baiting and you're running, it's work. It's not an easy thing, and it's not just going throwing it out. And those guys are going for the biggest fish they can get, you know, because they're throwing back because of, you know, to me, I think if they could keep a 10-pound fish, they'd throw back a 40-pound fish.
I don't know.
I hope.
I mean, boy, you get into some of the difficult answers to questions.
Sure.
Difficult. Yeah.
I ain't trying to put you on the spot.
Now,
That's just
getting
opinion.
twisted.
Yeah.
You get into some of the difficult questions to try to answer, you know, and I hear, you know, there's a guy in Texas that, you know, preaches this all the time, is the regulation only affects what it affects to some extent. So
Yeah.
if we drop from 10 fish to 5 fish, so this
Yeah.
is just hypothetical, then it only affects the people that are catching more than 5 fish.
Yeah.
And it's hard to, you get into a hypothetical realm when you start asking, would somebody have kept this fish under a different regulation?
Yeah.
So we can kind of speculate. There's, you know, if you do a bunch of creel stuff, there's kind of ways to look at that, but it still gets into difficult questions to answer. And I don't have the creel data to see whether people were turning fish loose before we put the slot on. I would question how many people of your jug liners were turning the big. I wouldn't think a lot of the jug liners, a lot of the people doing that were turning big fish.
No, but they were.
To begin with.
They weren't keeping. I mean, they go get their 5 fish and they were done.
Right.
You know what I mean? And now they're sorting through them and gill hooking them and killing them, and it's on that aspect for me, it's counterproductive.
Right.
I mean, I went on the jugging study in the MDC boat, and you know they were like, you know, tell us it's a good spot or whatever. The first fish we pulled up was 28 pounds. It was dead. And you know, there wasn't nothing you can do about it. It was in thermocline. It's a little early in the fall, probably for where we should have been, but it wasn't nothing you can do about it. You know. And then we passed a fish that was dead on a trout line. And I just hate to see, you know, sorting through those fish, and it's hard on them. You know that.
Would relying on guides like Jeff, who do a lot of catfishing, catch a lot of catfish, would his data, if you were to use his fish, would that skew the overall data
Well,
or create some kind
I
of
guess
bias?
that kind of you're in some ways you're getting into 2 questions.
Yeah.
You're getting to, you know, what we're going to do for our route reevaluation.
Yeah.
We'll do straight off the jug lines
Gotcha.
because we have a pre and we
You
have
have
a
to,
post.
yeah.
Yep.
It's data you collected before.
Now, beyond that, you know, for me as the Truman Lake biologist and my long-term plans, I would be open to using guide data
Yeah.
if we could work in a system that made sense.
Yeah.
You know, it has to make sense for you.
Yeah.
And it has to make sense for me. You know, well,
Yeah.
and that's kind of, I guess I could restate that. It has to make sense for you in your time, and it has to be good data for me. So you have to work through, you know, there's a lot of things that can sound simple.
Sure.
And then working through the details of having something that
Right.
is valuable. I think there's a possibility there. But I also think that, you know, there'd have to be some, you know, discussing what that looks like.
I obviously want what's best for the resource. You know, no, I was not a fan of the slot limit. I still don't care for it. But if it's doing good things, like I said, you know what? When you guys start your study and you see stuff and you can say, here's this and here's this. Look how much better this looks. Hey, I'm good with that. You know what I mean? I mean, that's black and white.
Yeah.
You know?
And it, kind of like I got into earlier, it gets into a lot of complicated questions.
Yeah.
And, you know, I have an aunt and uncle, they love to come down here. Well, they're getting old enough and have some health troubles they don't get to anymore.
Yeah.
Which, you know, is all the more reason to not like the slot, I guess, if you're against it. But, you know, my aunt, she gets worked up and out of shape if they catch too big a fish. She's like, I don't want to catch bigger fish. And, you know, for the person that doesn't want to catch big fish, the slot's not going to help you. You know?
Yeah.
If you're like, I don't want to catch trophy catfish, you're like, well, there's nothing, you know. So you get into the different user groups and what they want and what they're hoping to get. But, you know, as far as producing bigger fish, I don't have it. I feel confident that it's going to produce bigger fish.
Well, I mean, it has to a point, I would think.
It doesn't have to.
I mean,
that gets complicated, but so we're giving you 10 fish instead of 5 fish now. So if you hit those low 20s, my biggest concern about it would be how hard are those 20 to 26 inch fish getting hit. If you hit those 20 to 26 inch fish hard enough, then they have to make it to the slot to get protected, and that's something that we'll look at.
Those 26ers are getting beat.
Well,
I mean,
I don't doubt that.
You know that.
I don't doubt that.
You know that. I mean, they're getting beat, and it may be something. And this is something I've said too. You know, if it was like, I think it's Oklahoma that does that, and you know that's a different fishery, so it's not apples to apples. But I'm saying like one fish over 32 inches, or one fish over 30 inches, or whatever it is. One fish over 34 inches. You know, something like that would be a little bit more simple, I guess, and a little maybe even better for the fish, you know.
And that's where you get into the there's a lot of biologists.
Yeah.
Not just in Missouri. I've heard complaints in Tennessee.
And in Maryland, where they're an invasive species,
where the problem with the 1 over regulation is people have to catch 2 fish before it matters. And it's hard to get that data, how many people are catching 2 fish. And, you know, I asked one of the other catfish guides, like, how often do you go out and catch more than 2 overs per person, or more than 1 over per person in your boat, or more than 2 overs per person in your boat? And, you know, that'd be, Jeff, how often do you go out and you catch enough overs that if we dropped it back to 1, it makes a difference? And I'm sure you have some days where you catch enough overs that you could make a difference. But I think you're a pretty good fisherman, a lot better than a lot of them out there. So I don't know, when you get into the 1 over and stuff, that it complicates things a little bit. And you start, like, so a 1 over, you'd be, I mean, I think what you're hypothetically looking at is a 1 over. Are you looking at a 1 over 26?
Like a 1 over, no, like 1 over 32 or 1 over 34.
And which is kind of what, I mean, we got the slot.
Right.
So we give you.
But you keep a 28 incher, or a 29 incher, or a 30 incher, or a 31 incher, but you can only have 1 over 32 inches.
Well, then you're just letting people catch more fish. I mean, I guess
At
I'm
10?
not.
Not a 10. I'm not talking about 10. I'm talking about a 5.
5. Well, I mean, I guess the problem is,
I didn't say.
you know, I guess I wouldn't. I guess we got to get on the same page.
Yeah.
What we're talking about.
Yeah.
I think, you know, we had some studies, and what Kevin Sullivan did when he sent information out. Most people felt like the catfish fishery was declining on Truman Lake.
I want to know who those people were.
In
100%.
1990, late 90s, early 2000s, at least is for sure the quality of the fish. And we had a lot of input that said they felt like the fishery was declining.
I asked him personally for that input, and he didn't have any input. Nobody could show me where somebody said it was declining. There was nobody.
I have the numbers. I don't have the specific. I don't know if I could dig up the specific data, because Kevin retired a few years ago.
Yeah.
That's not,
it was.
you know,
I mean,
that's not a knock on Kevin. I think Kevin was
Right.
pretty organized and stuff, and it's probably in a folder on the, that I can access somewhere.
and it was far from the sport that it is now. I mean, look how big catfishing's got. Look how big crappie tournaments have got. Who'd have thought that stuff would ever from the old crappie thons, and I don't know if you guys remember that stuff or not, but I mean, that's them old little podunk tournaments. Well, they were big tournaments then, and now look how big it's gotten. Look how big catfish is gotten. Look how big tournament catfishing's gotten. I mean, it's crazy.
Well,
And I get the tournament angler thing too. I mean, I've fished some tournaments. I love to catch big. Well, you know that. I love to catch big. Well, I like to catch big catfish. If we can make bigger catfish, I'm all for making bigger catfish. But.
speaking of tournaments, kind of transitioning to another topic, because I think we hit catfish pretty good, and it sounds like we might be able to revisit it too on the next one. Bass fishing is a big deal, really big deal anymore these days, especially on the tournament side of things. Truman is kind of an under the radar bass lake a little bit here in Missouri. You got Lake of the Ozarks and Table Rock that are primarily bass fishing lakes. So I'm just kind of curious what you've been seeing on the bass. It seems like the bags have gotten a little bigger in the tournaments, in the low 20s a lot of the time over the summer. What's kind of like the state of the bass on Truman here?
I think they're in a little bit of an upswing, which because of 2019. Well, we not just 2019. 2015 we had some high water. I think 2017 I remember the high water because I was turkey hunting and it screwed me up. And 2019 we had some high water, and that's good for bass. And that's, I think, kind of resulted in an upswing. And I know I went out, started sampling. I lose track of time. A few weeks ago. Went out and I sampled and did a few samples, and it was just terrible. We weren't catching anything. But then, which is the problem you get into with sampling. A few weeks later, we went back to the same spot. The water jumped up a little bit, put it in the button bushes. The water temperature is raised a little bit, closer to where we want it, and we just hammered them. We caught quite a few 18 to 20 inch bass.
Wow.
And really good catch rates, and all of a sudden you're like, well, that looks a whole lot better than
No kidding.
I feel a lot better than I did last week about the bass population. So high water's good for bass.
Absolutely.
And that's kind of where we're at. But then from my standpoint, that puts me in I can't control the high water.
Right.
We can't get vegetation in Truman. It's just not an option.
Right.
When they jump the lake up and down and we're loaded with grass carp, we're not going to have any vegetation to help the bass. So, for me, bass is a tough topic because I'm not really sure what I can do to improve the bass fishery. It just it does what it does. If we get a few wet years, it does well. And if we get too many dry years in a row, they don't do well, and we're going to go back down. And I've seen a trend. If you look through all our data, we have slowly over the years kind of transitioned to more and more spotted bass in the population. It's still mostly largemouth, but you kind of see that transition in the data. Although I think these high years, spotted bass like the stable, clear water, I think the last couple of years have knocked the spotted bass back a little bit relative to the largemouths.
So I know there's bass guys out there watching that are probably dying to know where you just had a hell of a catch on the 18 to 21 inch bass.
We were in the first cove behind the visitors center. I guess we can all go out tomorrow and see how many boats are there.
Yeah.
We were electrofishing down through there, and there was a boat up in front of us fishing. And then we did 2 or 3 runs. We did our first run and stopped and start counting and measuring fish and stuff like that, working everything up. And the guy leaves, and then we pull in right behind him and shock him. Really nice.
Well, I tell you, I've been out when isn't it MU like the extension? They come up and do some shock fishing, or
so the USGS co-op unit does some fisheries study from time to time out of the University of Missouri.
Okay.
I guess they worked on a big catfish project recently.
And a grass carp one.
Okay, so that
before
was
that.
Yeah, he was he was more with USGS, but then he ended up with the co-op unit, kind of the same stuff. But
Well, I can tell you, like, when we'll be fishing in an area, and I'll be like, man, I smoked these things yesterday. And I'll look around and be like, well, there's that shock boat. I mean, it will shut them down. Like, if I see a shock boat, like, we're going a ways away. For what, I'm sure it messes them. Makes them not want to bite, but.
I know that it doesn't mess them up forever. I don't think it messes
No.
I'm
just talking while that's going on.
I don't think it messes up very long, but I wouldn't want to shock. I wouldn't want to fish behind it.
Right.
I'll tell you what, I'm like, every single time, you're like, oh, that never works.
What
You
was
need to pay attention to where we dump them on.
I know, that's right.
what was the biggest bass that you sampled so far this year?
I'd have to look at the data. I think it was 20 or 21 inches. It was over 20, but not a lot.
So that would probably been
we figured it was probably a 6 pound bass.
Yeah.
Close to it.
Interesting.
It was a little bit heavier when we caught it than it was a few minutes before because you could see the crappie tail sticking out.
Oh my goodness gracious, that's awesome. So that was done on the lower lake. I mean, do you have any idea as far as if you go up into the Pommy, up into the Osage or the Grand, what bass population looks like in those areas, or what's the story there?
We haven't got a lot of good bass samples in recently.
Okay.
Last year it rained a lot.
Yeah.
The year before it rained a whole lot. We got a pretty good sample in 2018, but that's been 3 years now. So we've had a hard time getting a good sample in the last few years. And I told you we got a good sample in this year, but that was one day we went out and got in some good sampling. I went out, put most of my effort apparently too early a couple weeks before, and we were struggling a lot to catch fish. And bass is kind of tough for me because it's not real easy to do because you can't shock areas where it's a bluff if it's too steep, and you can't shock if it's too shallow, which is everything that's filled in, and you can shock if there's trees, but the more trees, the harder the shocking is. And then it's kind of borderline on whether we should do it at night or during the day. If you do it at the night, then you have that many more trees you have to navigate. Not from getting around the lake. I know the lake well enough that we can get around in the dark, but then when you actually start going down the bank and you got trees everywhere, that's where you run into the issue. And then you got dirtier water as you go up the lake, which makes it harder, and it's tough for me to do a lot of jumping around the lake. You kind of have to, the scientist in me doesn't like settling in places, but it's hard to jump around when you're like, well, can we go over there? No, we can't go over there because it's silted in and you can't get up close to the bank. Can we go over there? Well, no, because it's a bluff. Can we go over there? Well, you can't hardly drive through that because there's no trees.
Hard to shock where the fish are.
It can be hard to shock where the fish are, and it can be hard for me to jump around the lake. And at this point, I've mostly kind of gone to some of the places that are our traditional sites that we've done for a long time. In some of the other reservoirs, I know they are down at Table Rock, and I think they're doing it at Stockton. They're randomizing all or most of the lake, and basically you pull a number out of a hat and you say we're going to this transect. And I'd love to go to something like that, but I'm afraid 2/3 of my transects are going to be, I can't do that one.
Right.
And I know you guys have probably thought about it, but what about there's a lot of tournaments won between Sterrett Creek and Long Shoal just simply because of release fish. But what if you went in and banged some of those release fish sites?
I haven't. I'm not sure exactly where they release their fish. Or do they just do it at the marinas? Or
they're mostly just done there at the marinas. So you can go in and bang around at the boat ramps or on the points right out from there or whatever.
Yeah, all the club tournaments, it's right at the marina. There's a few tournaments like Joe Bass where they actually have a release boat where they'll go and drop them.
But there's so many tournaments. 65+% tournament anglers that are fishing the lower lake are going to be fishing around Sterrett Creek and Longshore for release fish. It's just the name of the game sometimes, especially in the summer.
Well, and so this brings up another question I had, and I'm not sure that you've done any of this. I'm just curious if there's plans or any thoughts on it. there's been very few studies done nationwide on the impact of tournament bass fishing on the population. There has been some. Is that something that has ever been looked at on Truman? Any plans to, as far as like the potential for mortality rate goes, of a fish that's been hauled around all day, especially on Truman, where the best bass fishing, talk to any of the longtime guys, it's heat of the summer, and they'll be up real shallow a lot of times too. What's your thoughts on that? Are tournaments potentially having an impact? Don't know enough to even make a comment on it.
I don't have any doubt that they could be making an impact.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of what you're getting at is, it's hard to say that
Yeah.
without the study to say it. I don't see anything happening on Truman as far as that goes for looking at mortality, just because it costs money to do studies.
Yeah. It's a pretty crazy amount of stuff, putting telemetry and all the fish and whatnot.
I think I saw a couple. Are there some other states looking at that right now?
There's been the studies that I've read have all been done like quite a while ago, and they've all been up in the Northeast for the most part. The ones that I've seen. So,
but I'm almost thinking I'd seen an email where somebody was possibly looking at something like that, but I'd have to dive a little deeper. I'd have to refresh myself, and I can't remember where they would have been in the process, but I haven't heard of any talks like that in Missouri. And for me on Truman, I could spend a lot of time just working on catfish and crappie.
Oh yeah.
And it just becomes a time issue.
Yeah,
sure.
And I don't see any largemouth bass catch and release mortality studies happen on Truman in the near future. That's not to say that catch and release mortality isn't an issue, but I haven't seen any indication that there's funding or people wanting it.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was purely just out of curiosity. How big, so you're like the guy over Truman, but how big's like your team of people when you go out and do like the sampling? I mean, how many people help you with Truman?
I have a tech that's full-time that works under me basically, anytime I need some help, unless it's during the state fair. He does a bunch of state fair stuff, and there's 2-3 weeks where he's gone.
Yeah.
But other than that, I can have him help me anytime I want to, and then I have an hourly that I split with somebody else that if I need help from May through October, I can get an hourly help.
Gotcha.
And then kind of the way our team works, and it's been we've restructured, we reorged a little bit. If I have something important going on, there's people I can get to come out and help me.
Yeah.
And a lot of time what we'll do, like in trap netting season, I can do it with I can do it with 2 people, but it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
I can do it with 3 people, and it's not too bad if it's a short day. But it's just run smoother with 4 people.
Yeah.
And I'll typically have like a 3-person crew, me and my tech and an hourly, and then kind of have a 4th person of rotating in and out, somebody that wants to go out and see trap nets for a day. Maybe my supervisor, or somebody else around the region kind of rotate through.
Yeah.
And have other people in and out of the boat. So, but if there's something that we as a department prioritize, then I can get help on it.
Nice.
Yeah. That's cool.
Well, no, great conversation, and we're looking forward to having you back on to chat a little bit more about some of those other species. I think there's some pretty significant interest in walleye on Truman, so we'll look forward to chatting about that next go-round when we have you on next. I know some folks have questions and whatnot. What's the most appropriate, effective channel of communicating with you or the MDC in general about Truman Lake? Is that like an email or a phone number, or what would you say to that?
Oh, it really doesn't matter too much. Email or phone.
Okay.
I can. Yeah.
I imagine part of your job is communicating with the public, so I was just curious what the best way was to get a hold of you. If
it is, and yeah, if people email me or I get phone calls, I guess if I can answer an email then it's easier for me to work it into my schedule.
Yeah.
I don't have to catch your phone call. You don't have to catch me in the office.
Right.
So email works well in a lot of situations. Or if you email me and give me your phone number, I can call people back.
Okay. Okay.
I don't know. You can sit down and call somebody and talk to them for 30 minutes, or you can sit down for 30 minutes and write an email
Yeah.
and not be sure whether you answer the question.
Right. Yeah, gotcha. Well, good deal. With that, I mean, we're kind of at the end here. Our time frame we wanted to stay in. So
definitely want to have you back on again and talk about, I said, walleye and even more stuff. I know you brought all kinds of awesome information and more stuff you want to talk about.
Yeah.
And, there's hybrids is a big interest.
Mm-hmm.
It's getting bigger on Truman. The sport of hybrid fishing. I don't do it much, but there's a lot of people that's really getting big.
Mhm.
Walleye fishing starting to pick up a little bit more, and I think that's some more stuff we need to cover.
Mhm.
And anything that you got, any exciting news that's happening and
Yeah.
stuff that you're seeing.
Yeah,
wanna
and
talk about
you got paddlefish too.
paddlefish.
And maybe good to throw out the paddlefish survey. So if anybody has comments on the regulations,
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, we've got it up. I linked their press release onto TrumanLakeFishingIntel.com. So there's actually an article where you can go and read that whole thing, and then the link to go provide your comments is there. So you can go check that out and say whatever you want to say.
And if you've got a question, go to Truman Lake Fishing Intel or send one of us an email or message or text or whatever. And if you've got a question for Chris, we'll jot it down and we have him on again here soon. We'll ask that question.
yeah, if anybody has any questions about anything we covered today,
Yeah,
Yeah.
we can try to answer them.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, hey guys, we want to thank Chris Brooke, our good buddy, for being on today. We look forward to chatting with him here in the real near future. Until then, I'm Tyler Mahoney,
And I'm Jeff Falconberry.
and we'll catch you on the next one.